What has gone wrong in America today? At least according to George Washington. He told us in his farewell address to the nation in 1796, over 200 years ago, that we can never allow a power of Congress to be usurped or given over to a public or private agency for whatever good reason. It is always a good cause, but that good is only temporary because this power will always end up in the hands of cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men. And this abuse of the power of Congress, according to Washington, is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. This is America today. The powers of Congress is to legislate, right? But its powers to make laws and regulations have been given over to federal agencies in the executive branch. The truth is, there is no separation of powers in America anymore. And what is the result? As shown with this flow chart of how laws are sold in America, with the creation of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in 1988, the door was flung open to lobbyist involvement in writing our laws for themselves. This also coincides with the rising cost of running for office as corporations flooded Washington, D.C. with lobbyists and money, 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 proving George Washington is not only the father of our country, but a prophet, a seer into our future. Americans feel powerless today because we've ignored Washington's warning, and the powers of Congress, as delineated in our Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, have been usurped and given over to the public and private agencies of the executive branch. These private agencies include the Federal Reserve Bank, the FDA, the Securities Exchange Commission, and the CFTC, its sister regulator of commodities. Private corporations and commissions that wield major powers over our daily lives determined by a handful of people with ties to the very industries they are supposed to regulate. Public agencies include the U.S. EPA, Health and Human Services, the Department of Education, the Department of Interior, just to name a few. And all these public and private agencies write and make laws and regulations, all behind closed doors, which represents 90% of the laws we live under today. Laws and regulations that make up thousands upon thousands of pages of laws and regulations written, no, sold to accommodate those wealthy enough to afford the revolving door lobbyists to help write those laws that rule our lives. Yeah, it's a small club, and we're not in it. How does this affect your daily life? Let's take a look at Obamacare, or what I call Oh Be Careful. 1,250 pages long and no one read it. But did you know Obamacare required Health and Human Services to write the next 10,000 pages in private? Legislation that was written by lobbyists to aid and abet private corporations? And what's the result? Americans pay 18% of the nation's GDP for health care, and no one is essentially covered, while the rest of the developed world spends 8% of its GDP and covers everyone. That's right, we Americans are ripped off for $1.9 trillion a year in health care costs alone. 90% of prescription drugs are generic, yet their production is assigned monopolies by the private federal or Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, sending medicine costs skyrocketing. Healthcare insurance costs more than your mortgage today, if you can afford one, because 75% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, some worse than that. Then there's the private corporation that rules over our money, the Federal Reserve Bank, and 7 people compromised by Wall Street and connected to Ivy League universities determine the monetary policies for 330 million people living in America and impacts the lives of billions overseas. What are the effects of the 0% interest rates and quantitative easing policies of the private Federal Reserve Bank? Well, abusing their usurped powers of Congress, Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 5. According to SprottMoney.com, the transfer of wealth from savers to borrowers is $2.4 trillion annually. The only fear in the Federal Reserve Bank is any audit, because revealing their abuse will ultimately lead to Congress reclaiming its constitutional power to determine the monetary policies that rule our lives. Added up, Americans are being scammed by a corrupt government for $4.3 trillion before we even consider the 40% of GDP all state, local, and federal taxes take up, which amount to $7.5 trillion. Together, that's $12 trillion with poor service to boot. That's over 60% of the nation's gross domestic product, our GDP. No wonder the middle class is history. And to paraphrase George Carlin, the reason they call it the American dream is because you have to be asleep to believe it. No wonder people feel powerless in the face of our government. We are. Because when you think about it, Congress is the people's place in our government. And if Congress has no powers left, well, then neither do we the people. Our powers of Congress have been also awarded to the High Court, resulting in the most egregious bench laws of Roe v. Wade and Citizens United, the first of which steals innocent lives, the second, our elections. So the question is, how do we restore the constitutional powers of the people back to Congress? How do we take back America? Let me introduce you to liberty legislation, term limits, which needs no explanation, in two bills before Congress today. One, the REINS Act, which would force all agency laws back to Congress for passage. The second, known as H.R. 24, the Federal Reserve Bank Transparency Act, is a $5 million audit of the Federal Reserve since 2010. Did you know the Fed has never been audited in over 100 years? And during this time, the dollar has gone from being worth $1 down to a penny in purchasing power. If we can pass these two bills, the REINS Act and audit the Fed, we will have righted the very wrongs that Washington warned America must never do, but which we have done. And in our folly, we have created an imperial presidency and a swamp of corruption ruled by corporations and lobbyists our Constitution never intended. I know America has many problems today, but we must right this wrong, and by doing so, right our ship of state, turn it around, and begin sailing into the light of liberty. This will solve nearly every problem before us, because nearly every problem in America is caused by our corrupt government, whose powers have been taken over by the cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men Washington warned us of. I understand it sounds simple, but if we can explain our world with one variable that strikes at the heart of the problem, we should. This keep it simple rule does not deny that reality is complex, but it forces us to focus on the most fundamental drivers of this corrupt government that underlies all of our problems, a complexity that too often leaves us confused by design. It reminds me of the story of the policeman who comes upon an inebriated fellow searching the pavement beneath a street light. He asks, "What are you looking for?" The man says, "My keys." The officer says, "I'll help you." Together, after looking about, the officer soon asks the fellow, "Are you sure you lost your keys here? I don't see them anywhere." The fellow looks up and points to the park nearby. "Oh no, I lost my keys in the park. But this is where they put the light." Why am I best qualified to represent the 17th District in Congress? Because I have taken the time to listen to George Washington, to study and understand the true design of our Constitution and the intent of its framers and our founders, which is to provide for the people to rule over their government rather than to be ruled by it. Congress is full of millionaires and deal makers. I suggest we send someone from the general population armed with the knowledge and tempered with the steel to represent all of the people and get this job done. America is upon the throes of great danger, threatened from both within and from without. Did you know that history defines revolutions as governmental bankruptcy? And our federal government, with a debt-to-income ratio of 105% and growing, is bankrupt. Its off-balance sheet obligations stretch that number to nearly 1,000%, and it is dragging we Americans to the brink. It is inevitable, and the day of reckoning is coming, a day when the governing business that rules America will be reorganized by hook or by crook in the parlance of history. I prefer to accomplish the same in peace and do it proactively, with your kind assent. Today, the best service any congressman can make to the people he serves is to be relentless in the restoration of our collective liberty and freedom. It must be done. This is the way to national security. It is the way to prosperity and good jobs for all. It is the way of life to the unborn and real health care for all Americans. And so I ask you to join me and focus upon the very point of pressure that will make a difference in our lives, to restore the people's rule over our government. This defines the state of liberty, and only from it does flow freedom, justice, and a rising tide of wealth that lifts all Americans together. It is the only way. You can read more about liberty legislation on my website, electfawell.com, and I encourage you to do so. Thank you for your time. God bless America and everyone in it.